Welcome to the podcast tonight. I'm here with my favorite guest, Greg Smith. Tonight, we're going to be talking about postmodernism and its influence on the church.
Amen. And I am honored to know that I am your favorite guest. I'll have to look a little later and see if you have any other guests, because it'll be even more honoring if there's more than one.
There's not yet.
Okay. We were talking a little bit beforehand about, how it's less important, how close we get to the textbook definitions of everything than it is how it actually works itself out in practice in the lives of Christians. In other words, if you say, well, postmodernists say this, or this, and somebody can go back and find some, something from Foucault or Lyotard or one of the early postmodernists, or even later ones, whatever, critical theorists, Derek Bell or whatever, says, well, that's not exactly how they say it. That's not nearly as important as whether they exactly say it that way or not. I'm watching people live it that way. That's what concerns me. I mean, I'm watching it right before my eyes. People are absolutely pickled in and influenced by this philosophy, which is completely refuted by the whole of Scripture. Do you agree with what I'm saying there as far as that's concerned?
Okay, sure. But maybe we should start with actually, what is postmodernism? Can you give a definition of it, or at least some kind of a general observation of what postmodernism is?
Well, postmodernism,
from how it was developed, that kind of thing.
Postmodernism was a response to modernism, which was itself a response to, what people viewed as the religious, superstitious age that came before it. Basically, modernism had the logical model correct, even biblically speaking. In other words, modernism said we arrive at conclusions based upon the proper analysis of data and facts as they exist in reality. Now, of course, they brought to that a whole set of presuppositions that weren't biblical, and they excluded the supernatural, for instance, in many cases, and so on and so forth. But in the view of many, sociologically oriented types, that led to things like capitalism, or the whole idea of the oppressed and oppressor models that we hear so much about today. And postmodernism was a response to that. This is very abbreviated and probably not in the most scholarly terms. I confess I have not sat down with a dozen textbooks and read through all this, but I have absorbed quite a bit of it. Postmodernism basically has as its foundation the idea that if there is such a thing as absolute and certain truth, man is not capable of arriving at it. We're never going to come to a conclusion. And it's working itself out now, as you can see, even in mathematics, like in our country, where 2 + 2 might not necessarily always be 4. So the idea that if there is absolute certain truth, mankind is incapable of ever really truly arriving at it. It's really a matter of what becomes true for you. That's why we hear so much talk nowadays about lived experience, for instance, or standpoint epistemology, where what's reality for you, what you have lived, is reality as far as you're concerned, and nobody can tell you otherwise. Of course, the trouble with that is that you can live a life full of experiences that you interpret in ways that are against the Scripture and even against reality itself. And if that's your truth, then there's nobody can tell you otherwise. And that's a real problem, because Christianity is a revelation, the self-revelation of the one true and living God to his creatures created in his image and likeness. Immediately, that flies in the face of what Christianity actually is. And again, the world's going to do what the world does. You expect every kind of foolishness there is from the world. The history of philosophy goes back, well before the time of Christ. And some very smart people have mused over and wrestled with these questions for millennia. You don't have to be a Christian to be smart. Some of the most brilliant people who ever lived were not believers. Their problem is not that they're stupid. The problem is that they're not saved. They're dead in sin. And they use the gifts that God's given them of intelligence and powers of analysis, for instance, and they reach sometimes sound conclusions, but for the wrong reasons and on the wrong basis. So this has been going on for a long, long time. This newest iteration that we're in the middle of now is basically a branch of worldly philosophy.
Well, let's set a little bit. Let's set a little bit more groundwork here, because I'm really curious as to where this school of thought came from, and it's my understanding that a lot of this postmodern way of thinking was actually developed through Karl Marx and his ideas out of the Frankfurt School, and it's developed over the years into what we see today. But its original grounding, it dates way back to the ideas of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud and people like that, right?
Well, that's true.
Or do you think that it actually even predates them to a significant degree?
Now, I would say that postmodernism, as we know it, actually built upon and grew out of those. I would say it's actually more recent, at least in the packaged form that we see it today.
Right.
They did embrace, like, when we say they, of course, postmodernism or postmodernists, the early ones, the ones that the people who are proponents of this, the scholars of it, quote unquote, the ones that they view as being like their philosophical forefathers, they weren't of one exact mind on every single thing either. It's not like you can say postmodernist and that applies to every single one of them there ever was, but they do have some ideas in common. And yes, they grew out of the ideas of Marx, for instance, especially that the whole socioeconomic thing. You know, their idea was, in order for there to be pretty much what we see now, in order for there to be justice, you had to take, I don't know how to explain it exactly, you know, how they co-opted the ideas of Marx, but it was kind of like Marx merged into their thought and they passed it on, and it became critical theory. And then critical theory has branched out to things like critical race theory. We got critical everything theory now. Fill in the blank. Critical gender theory. You know, so again, I don't know exactly how to explain the way that they, you know, a scholarly exposition of how they incorporated the ideas, especially of Marx, but they did, into their thought. Everybody's always seeking after a better world, or so they say. And that better world always means that somebody's on top and somebody else is on the bottom, no matter how many ways they try and say it doesn't mean that. In this case, they were trying to do away with that. They wanted to have the idea that everybody's treated justly, everybody's treated equally. And it always winds up every single time with somebody on the top dictating to those that are on the bottom. I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, or I don't even know if I'm exactly qualified to answer it in the detail that you're asking me for. But philosophies always flow from one another. You can see it, you know, throughout all of history. Very rarely does somebody come along and just break entirely from everything everybody said before. Even someone like Immanuel Kant, which people say he was a revolution in philosophical thought, he still stood on the shoulders of people that went before him. You know, there's a stream of philosophical thought going back to the ancient Greeks that, you know, brings us to where we are today. What they all have in common is they start with the idea that whatever the answers are, the God of the Bible is not it. They try to subject the one true and living God to their analysis rather than him being the basis upon which any analysis is even possible. Excuse me. In the case of, you know, postmodern critical theory that we're in the middle of right now, again, the way that it works out, the way that you see people living it is what's most important. I have people that I know personally, people I've been close to, who are heavily influenced by this now. I had a woman on my own Facebook page talking about my supremacy, about the reason I'm saying the things I'm saying is because of my white supremacy. I mean, it sounded, I'm not trying to be sarcastic to her, but it sounded like a copy and paste out of an Ibram X. Kendi book.
Okay, can we dial it back a notch here? Because we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. I want our viewers to have a very robust understanding of what we're talking about here when we say postmodernism. So I'm kind of trying to build a picture and paint a picture of exactly what this is, how postmodernists think, how they relate to the world around them, how they relate to objective truth and morality and these kinds of things. So it's my understanding, and I'm not an expert either on postmodernism, but postmodernists in general would typically reject any kind of objective truth. Like you said, postmodernists would say that, if there is absolute truth, man cannot arrive at it. But why did they think that? What is the missing link there that would cause them to not think that man can understand, can arrive at the knowledge of absolute truth? Does that make sense?
I think they would probably say that it's been tried for so long, and there's been one long parade of failures after another. I think that, in my opinion, which I believe to be correct according to the scriptures, they want to eliminate the idea of absolute, objective, certain truth, especially moral truth, because men love darkness. I mean, it's really no more complicated than that. The light is coming to the world, but men love darkness because their deeds were evil. Adopting this particular mindset throws the gates open for any kind of behavior that you find personally fulfilling according to you. On basically anything, whether it be economics, whether it be, sexual practice, whether it be your interaction in business or whatever. They once you adopt this viewpoint, there basically are no rules. Now, they would probably say, well, no, there are, there's conventions that people arrive at. That's one of the favorite things people talk about. Well, the reason we behave a certain way is because that's a convention that's been adopted. But they don't like all the ones that have been in Western civilization, for instance. So, why would they say that, certain objective truth is unknowable? Because it's convenient. It's morally convenient for them. They can manufacture, like we were talking about last time, they can manufacture, faults and sins and evils that fit whatever particular agenda they want to put forward.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but at some point in this podcast, we're going to get to its influence in the church, and even like mainstream evangelicalism and people who would actually hold to at least some form of objective biblical truth as far as morality is concerned, but yet have been so massively influenced by this postmodernism. Like what is it about it that's so attractive? Like, to not just to the world, but to even to people who do ascribe to objective morality. You understand what I'm asking?
Why would someone who claims to be a Christian and does believe in the settled, certain truth of the revealed word of God, how could they possibly, imbibe in this and be influenced by it? You would think, out of hand, that would eliminate any possibility of this kind of thinking. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, there's something attractive about it that's more than just wanting to be able to hide from objective morality.
In the case of Christian, the world does it trying to hide from objective morality. Of course, you do have very liberal Christian, quote unquote Christians, very liberal professing Christians who also want to hide from objective morality. I really believe, this is an opinion I'm willing to be talked out of, but I've been observing people, who are in the middle of this for quite a while now. I think it's a form of self-righteousness. It makes them feel, I'm a good person. I am working for the good of others. I am on board with the right agenda that wants to love my neighbor as myself. They Christianize it, and it makes them feel like they have sort of an elitist attitude, like those who don't get it just aren't quite as morally upright as I am. It gives them an air of superiority. In the church, you see it in the way that they talk to people who don't subscribe to it. They won't debate it. There's been several people who have offered to debate some of these people. They don't want you don't debate it because debate presupposes that there's a standard that both people are going to subscribe to, so you don't ever debate it. It's a fair self-satisfaction. Does that make sense? It makes them feel above others. Then there's a second part. Go ahead. Now I was going to say there's another way that works itself out. Not just that sense of self-superiority. Now, of course, if you'd asked them that, if one of them was sitting here next to me and we were having this conversation, no, it's definitely not that, because they know enough scripture to know that would be bad. We don't want to be, pharisaical. We don't want to be, I thank thee, Lord, that I'm not like this fundamentalist here who doesn't see the truth of critical race theory and how, the country's oppressing people, so on and so forth. They would never admit to that. But there's also the problem that it has become so popular and so widespread in the culture, and the bigwigs, the celebrity types, the ones who want recognition, who want to sell books, who want to fill conference halls, who want to be on TV. In order to do that, you have to be on board with what's popular. And because that has become the lingua franca of the culture, they feel like, this mindset, it's been around forever. In order to influence the culture for Jesus, you have to adopt what they've adopted and try and Christianize it. And right now, the biggest names, the people selling the books, the people who are packing the conference halls, the people who are getting all the attention and all the accolades are these critical theorists. And once you've taken the mindset, and you can convince yourself of anything, that, my growing recognition, my growing book sales, my growing influence, that has to be to God's glory. It has to be good that I'm getting all this influence. And as soon as you tell somebody, or even if they suspect that, maybe this really is an antichrist philosophy drawn from the world and really has nothing to do with the gospel and is injurious to the people that it claims to help, they will talk themselves out of that if you're sufficiently addicted to the attention and the accolades and even to a certain degree the money that comes along with being at the cool kids table. Does that make any sense? I know people who personally who that is also the case with.
Who?
That it's the case. That's going to become. I'd rather. There's. What's that? Not you.
Who do you know personally that's the case with?
I'm thinking of one pastor in particular that is really addicted to having the big names on his radio show, and the biggest names right now are Jamar Tisby, for instance, and all of these critical race theory types. And if you want to have the big radio show with all the listenership, you can't come against that, because that's the kind of thing that gets you attention right now. If you were to ask him, if you were to sit down and talk to him for 3 hours about the word, you'd be like, this guy's solid, rock solid. Even reformed. He's not a heretic. But in order for your ministry to get that kind of attention, you have to be where the attention is, and that's where the attention is. If I want to have a radio show every day, I'll tell you what, I could never do a daily radio show that has guests on it, because I don't think after a month I'd run out of people I wanted to have on. I don't think there's very many people out there that are worth listening to. That's not trying to build myself up on some kind of pedestal either. Just by biblical standards, we are at a shortage for clear, sound biblical voices out there. You have to start bringing in the people that are popular. That's how you get the advertisers. That's how you get the radio stations to take on your program. You don't do that by being the lone voice that says, by the way, most of what everybody's doing out there is wrong. So you can talk yourself into believing I must be glorifying God. Or, look, I'm bringing justice. I'm working for justice. While at the same time, and here's another problem with this, you can say, I don't believe in critical race theory. And again, this person I'm talking about, you can talk to him for an hour about, he'd be like, this guy really doesn't believe in critical race theory. And the next day, turn on his radio show, and Jarvis Williams is the guest, and he's pushing his book. I'm not saying it to be mean or sarcastic, but that's another thing that happens with people once postmodernism takes root in somebody's mind. You can live a walking contradiction and somehow make that okay with you.
All right, let's do this. Let's start talking about some of these people that you named, like Jamar Tisby and Jarvis Williams. These people are mainstream influencers in the evangelical church. Say again?
No, I didn't say nothing. I'm listening.
Okay. These people are mainstream influencers in the evangelical church. When we talk about Jarvis Williams, for example, and he recently, or a couple of years ago, wrote a book called Removing the Stain of Racism from the Southern Baptist Convention. Um, he's a professor at a Southern Baptist seminary, the biggest one, Southern. Uh, I read the book.
I confess I have not, so I'll defer to you for that. But
basically, the idea was that in order to remove the stain, which hence the title of the Southern Baptist Convention's past sins of slavery and racism, it's going to entail basically a perpetual type of penance that starts with acknowledgement of our sin, acknowledgement of our white privilege, mostly for white people, because the SBC is made up of mostly white people.
yeah.
So, I mean, this is critical race theory. So all right. So my question would be, with people like this, how is postmodernism related to this type of influence, such as critical race theory in the church?
Well, critical race theory is a subset of postmodernism.
Right.
Its main mindset grows out of the previous postmodern the generation of postmodern philosophers that came mainly out of France in the early 20th
All right,
century.
So that's what I want to talk about. How like what part of it, when you say it's a subset of postmodernism, critical race theory itself is basically theory. It's unprovable. It basically relies on anecdotal evidence of the lived experiences of individual people in society to create this idea of a collective system of racism between an oppressor class and the oppressed class. And in this situation, it's, of course, white people are the oppressors and black people are the oppressed. But when we talk about postmodern thought, and we've already kind of established that postmodern thought is essentially a rejection of objective truth, how does that relate to critical race theory, or critical theory in itself, and then critical race theory?
Well,
I'm just trying to steer this in a direction to try to connect the dots here.
Well, you see in practice the things that postmodernism preached in academia. It's changed a little bit. It's kind of evolved a little bit since then. But the idea that there is settled objective truth that is always true for all peoples, for all time, is rejected by critical theorists because they have imbibed that mindset from their postmodern forefathers. And in this case, like you just said, the model is oppressive white people and basically oppressed everybody else who isn't white, but mainly black people, because we have our history of slavery and so on and so forth. So you can't, how it's working itself out right now is actually an attack on things such as, they'll derisively call something, or our society, a meritocracy, where people are advanced based upon merit, based upon performance, based upon objective standards. Here's what you need to achieve. If you want to move through this station in life, there's a standard that you have to live up to and achieve, and then you have moved into that station and standard in life. That's an objective standard. It's a truth. If you want to be a mathematician, for instance, here are certain things in mathematics that you have to this oppressed. I think we might be having a little bandwidth issue here.
You're good. You cut out for a second, but go ahead.
The reason or the rationale for that appears to be basically because white people have advanced that. It's evil just because there's been more white people in North America, since the 19th century than anybody else. And it was our idea somehow I say our idea because I'm a white man, obviously. And by virtue of the fact that we've advanced it, it's automatically wrong because it came from us. The idea of, a meritocracy, the idea that, a person's achievement, a person's value in society is based upon merit. In other words, like we talked about, or like Vodi Bakum talked about, any other explanation is automatically eliminated because they've concluded out of hand that it must be because white oppressors have created this society of meritocracy, this society where objective truths and academic achievement is what gets you ahead. The fact that came from white people, ipso facto, by definition, makes it wrong. And we have to find an alternative to that. And their alternative to that, as we're seeing now, takes the form of things like, affirmative action, for instance, in all sorts of different areas, where black people are not held to the same standard because that standard itself is automatically seen as whiteness. So how that comes from postmodernism because, the idea of an objective standard that has, from the beginning of time, let's take it from the secular standpoint, from millions and millions of years ago to the present, the idea that there's an objective standard that's always true for everybody, that has to be rejected, because if it's not rejected, we might be right. The idea that, there actually is a standard that's always true for everybody. I'm saying using standard in a generic term, it can apply in many different areas of life. But if that's actually true, Western society appears to have the best argument for that. And since we can't have that be correct, we have to find a way around it. And the way that we find our way around it is to deny that objective truth exists altogether. That way we sidestep the idea of white America or the whiteness of America actually being in possession of that objective truth that everybody should live up to no matter what color they are. It becomes white again, whiteness is the evil standard and everybody else has been held in oppression underneath that standard. When biblically speaking, there is that standard. And Western civilization grew out of the Reformation. It's, these ideas are not true because they're white or because Western European, largely white people propounded them from the Reformation to the present day. They're not true because of that. They're true because they're according to Scripture. It wouldn't have mattered where they came from. This is the part that drives me insane. Who cares? What difference does it make whether white people or some other, ethnic derivation were the ones that advanced it? What matters is whether it's true or not. And when someone like Williams says, we need to get out of this idea about having more black people in white spaces, but we need to do away with the white spaces, that works itself out practically in doing away with spaces where there's truth, where there's objective truth, where there's unassailable, always a standardized truth for everybody. I think that's the part that aggravates me the worst. When I say aggravates, I don't mean like an unrighteous rage, but the part that just goes against the gospel grain is the idea that, the things that came out of the Protestant Reformation, the theology, even the philosophy. Theology and philosophy are, they're kind of like, there's lots of philosophy in the Bible, but it's biblical philosophy. But the idea that those truths are somehow to be rejected now, and there has to be a black version of that, or not even a black version of that, a separate black gospel almost.
I'm going to try to play something real quick. I'm going to try to play something real quick and get your reaction to it. So hopefully you can hear it.
Yeah, hopefully.
Can you hear that?
The tangible evidence of making anything an idol is that thing taking the place of our God, or is it pointing us to God? So I think one way that race can become an idol is that we prioritize one group over another because of race. So if a person is a racist, and I think we all have racism in our hearts. I don't think minorities are immune to racism. Red and yellow, black and white, we're all racist in His sight, apart from the gospel.
Let me pause that real quick. The first thing he said there was, "I think we all have racism in our heart." What is your reaction to that comment?
Let me think for a second. I think I know what he means. If he's saying that there is a natural tendency for people to cluster together culturally and societally based upon what particular part of the world they are ethnically descended from, I think there's probably something to that, just looking at the world in practice. Black people tend to want to marry other black people, and white people tend to, by and large, of course, there's exceptions in there. And we can see that, like, even around our own country. Now, he would point to this as being an absolute definition of racism. I lived in New York for 7 years. There are entire sections of New York where there is like 100,000 residents where nobody speaks English. They all cluster together from, say, the Dominican Republic. There's whole areas of like Washington Heights, Manhattan, and they have a tendency to group themselves together. And I'm not saying it in a sarcastic way. I'm saying that's a natural tendency. I think that is a natural tendency for people to gravitate towards the people that they're familiar with. I don't even necessarily think that that's sinful in and of itself, depending on what's done with it and how it's worked out. If that's what he's defining as racism, the idea that people have a tendency to even favor, their own ethnic group, for lack of a better term, I think there's probably something to the fact that most people, at least, have that tendency. But I would deny the fact that that tendency in and of itself is automatically sinful. What is your response to that?
Okay. Is that racism, though? That's the question. Because it sounds like these people have redefined what actual racism is. Traditionally, we would define racism as a prejudice against somebody else, or even a strong dislike or even a hatred of another person simply because of the color of their skin. But that doesn't seem to be what their definition of racism is today.
No, that's right.
It's like we're dealing with an entirely different animal here. So I think what are your thoughts on this new definition of racism?
Well, I think I agree with you that it's totally unbiblical. I think we talked about this last time, or maybe we talked about it off the air or whatever. But yeah, this idea that racism is what's that?
I said I think we talked about it off air.
Right, but this idea that racism is now being defined as something that you are not consciously aware of, meaning that the fact, for instance, myself as a white man, I was born blonde and blue, 1964 in Dearborn, Michigan. I had absolutely no control over that. And the fact that I have existed and come up in a white society that appears at least to favor white people, unless I am crying out against that and working feverishly to see to it that it stops, I am by definition of a racism simply by the fact that I exist in this society. I reject that. That is, there cannot be sin in something that your will is not involved in.
Okay. I think when we go through this video and possibly the next one, we're going to see that he thinks that this is sinful. So let's continue that video.
Because of Adam's transgression. Now, I think historically, when you define racism, it's usually defined by as something that exists because of the majority group that's in power racializing people and then working to make the circumstances for those people who are the marginalized group difficult because of their race. So racism is historically attached to, I think, power and privilege. But my point.
Do you agree with that? Racism is historically attached to power and privilege?
No.
Okay.
Would be
not by definition. It can be the case that people with power and privilege. Go ahead.
Somebody is prioritizing race or is a racist. That's probably an evidence that a person is making race an idol. I think anytime one I think separates race from the overarching work of God in Christ, that could set one up for racial idolatry. If the goal is simply to be Afrocentric or Anglocentric, for the purpose of promoting that racial identity as superior over other, then that, I would argue, is perhaps an evidence that there's idolatry. I think, man, when you see, I think images are powerful. And I like art, but I don't really know anything about it. I'm not artistic at all, but I'm so thankful for people who are able to be artistic and to communicate powerful images and symbols through art. But one thing I do know about art is that art symbolically represents worldviews. And I think when we see images that are highlighted, that prioritize a certain racial group as being beautiful and other racial groups as being inferior or more prone to criminality, I think those of us who believe those images could in fact believe those because there's an idolatry in our hearts that is reflective of this.
What is he talking about here, Greg? Like, what is he talking about? Art that portrays one racial group as beautiful but not the other, or whatever it is he's getting at here.
I am with him. I'm not a big art guy. The reason for that is because there is precious little art in the Bible, but that's another story. I think there probably exists somewhere. Maybe, I haven't been to the great art galleries of the world. What he's basically, I know you understand what he's saying. He's basically saying that, for instance, say in Western Europe, you're going to find artistic representations of Western Europeans as being the noble, basically upright, for the most part, maybe with some exceptions, the smartest, the most progressive in the sense of advancing, human achievement and so on and so forth. And people of other races, like, for instance, say of African descent, are seen as lowly and less intelligent and less contributory to the good of mankind, throughout history.
But is that racial or is that cultural?
Well, you'd have to take that on a case-by-case basis. I'm not going to be the one to say it's impossible that an artist portrays someone from a racist standpoint. Maybe there are some who did, but the reason I'm showing this video first is to get your reaction to that, because I think the next one that I play for him is actually going to answer this question for us both. And there's a bigger principle in here too I'm going to hang on to.
Yeah, hang on to it, and let's finish this one, and then I think the next video will actually answer a lot of this, and then we'll get your reaction.
Racist idolatry, you see. So I think those sorts of things would be examples. I think examples like implicit biases, assuming that I'm inferior or superior based on my complexion, is an example of the idolatry of race. It's not simply being passionate about something, talking about something. I love basketball. But the love for basketball is not problematic as long as I'm not worshiping that instead of God. And I love talking about basketball. So the issue is not what do you talk about a lot or what are you passionate about. I think the issue is what are you prioritizing over and above God and over and above God in Christ. And if we are doing anything to prioritize gender.
And see, and that's the thing. I think you and I would both agree that there's truth in that statement.
Yeah.
But the question here is, really, who's really doing that? Who's explaining it? Well, and again, I think the next video will answer that question. But sure, there are a lot of people out there who prioritize their own ethnicity and skin complexion over others. But by and large, this entire movement really has nothing to do with skin color. And again, the next video will answer that. So, what do you think about that?
No, I think that the people most guilty at this moment in American history, let's say Western history, but American history in particular, since we're both Americans, the people most guilty of what he's talking about are the people that he's allied with. You can say, well, to be obsessed with race, to give it undue attention, to have it occupy your mind and your thoughts, and to the point where it takes the place of maybe these people are doing that.
Exactly.
It reminds me of, years ago, I saw Kenneth, hang on to that for just a second. Years ago, 30 years ago, I saw Kenneth Hagin giving a warning about name it and claim it people. It's like, well, there's people out there have taken this to an extreme. They've taken it to unbiblical, ungodly extremes. And you got to watch out for those folks, not realizing that it's him. He was the very one doing the thing that he was warning people against. So I'm kind of making an analogy here. Williams is saying, people who do these things, that's when it's really taking a place of God. You got to be careful. And all the people, not I would say all the people, but a large portion of the people, definitely the people in the world, are doing exactly what he's decrying here. Go ahead.
Or fill in the blank, then that is an example of idolatry. Certainly there are gender distinctions in the Bible. Certainly there are different ethnic groups, different racial groups, but all people deserve dignity. And when we fail to show the dignity to those people from different tongue, tribes, people, and nation, then that might reflect the idol in our heart that flows out of a racist ideology.
If you're really doing that.
Right.
I have to agree with what he just said. If you are, somehow elevating your own particular ethnic designation above others, if you're really doing that, then yes, that would be sinful. The trouble is they give a definition to that so that you almost can't avoid not being guilty of it.
Let me bring up the next one. Hopefully you can hear this one too.
That would be a real plus, wouldn't it?
So then the question is, what is whiteness? Well, here's something that's very important to realize. Whiteness is not about your biology, it's about an ideology. It's a biological fiction, but a social fact.
Yeah.
When you think about the category of whiteness, it emerges also in our context in colonialism, where race is emerging as a category of racial hierarchy. So one aspect of whiteness was a way for Europeans who were different to homogenize themselves into a group known as white, to distinguish themselves from these enslaved Africans whom they did not believe had souls and whom they identified as heathen. One reason we get slavery is because of the construct of whiteness. One reason, right? Of course, slavery is complicated. But race, hear this carefully, I'm going to lean in on this one, all right? I'm trying to be pastoral. Race and the construct of whiteness, these categories are bad because they have worked historically and socially to prioritize those who identify with whiteness, namely those who would be white people, and those who, to marginalize those who are not white, namely enslaved Africans or brown people. So when you think about issues of the Confederacy and the flag, that represents white power, white privilege. What's white privilege? That's also complicated, but one privilege of whiteness was you couldn't be a slave.
That's right.
One privilege of whiteness was you had your own water fountain. One privilege of whiteness was you went to the best schools during Jim Crowism. One privilege of whiteness was you didn't get lynched. Are you with me? Do I need to pull back a little bit, or can I keep leaning into this? So what the flag represents to many black and brown people, and I don't speak for all of them, but to many of us it represents white terrorism against non-white people. So when my wife, who's Hispanic, and my multiracial son, and I drive through Tennessee, which we did recently, and we see a Confederate flag, we don't think Southern heritage, we think white supremacy, and we flee that town fearing for our lives when we see that flag. When I was in Shelby County, Kentucky the other day, pulling out of a parking lot, saw a white supremacist Confederate flag on top of a Jesus flag. There's a white Confederate flag and a Jesus flag side by side. We got out of there, right? So how I think about this is that a Confederate flag and those monuments remind black and brown people often of their racialized inferiority. Not actual inferiority, but racialized inferiority that was created because of a biological fiction, but a social fact. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So one thing that Christians must always do on this issue, and this is why the gospel is so important, we must view the world through the lens of the cross and the resurrection. Our brown skin,
Yeah.
our brown skin, Mediterranean, Jewish Messiah,
Yeah.
who probably looked more like Ho, me, and Curtis and Brian than he looked like Ric Flair, right? Died on the cross,
That's right.
resurrected from the dead to kill all idols.
That's right.
And one idol, okay, let me calm down. One idol is the perpetuation of white supremacy
Yeah.
and the artifacts that symbolize white power and privilege.
Okay. I'm not making fun of the man. Clearly, this is a smart guy. But
Hey, see, before you go, I just want to say there's so much in there that's true. A lot.
yeah,
But the problem is it's like the entire premise of everything that he said that was true, the entire premise that he's building that truth on is false, and it just falls down and collapses on itself.
the biggest
go ahead.
problem, in my view at least, the biggest problem with this is a preoccupation with the world. You know, I will probably be drawn and quartered, tarred and feathered for saying this by some people, but there are times when I really kind of wish I were black, in the sense so that I could walk in black skin and demonstrate what I wish people would do. Not that there's not people out there doing it, because they are.
There's plenty of people out there doing it. But see, this gets to the root of what he said at the very beginning of that last clip, that whiteness is not about ethnicity, it's an ideology. And, you know, when he views people, at least it sounds like, when he views someone like Vody Balcom or Daryl Harrison or somebody like that who's not caught up in this racialized nonsense, he views them as caught up in this ideology of whiteness.
Right. And they say that outright. But again, my biggest problem with this from a gospel standpoint is not that it is of no significance, but who cares what the world does? Why are you obsessed with a flag that stopped having any real threat to you well over 100 years ago? I can promise you, just about promise you. I've never been to the town he's talking about, but I can just about promise you. Let me put it this way. I would be utterly shocked if he fled from that town in any actual danger. Nobody there was looking to kill him, hurt him, probably even to look at him weird. It's just
and he knows that. He knows that this is all drama.
Nobody's looking. There was a lot more to the Confederacy than slavery too. There was an entire difference in the way they viewed the state and the relationship of the federal government to the state, for instance. It wasn't all about slavery. The Confederate flag was, we just wanted to keep our slaves. Slavery was a major issue in the South, but it was not the only one, and it was not the only major one. There was a bunch of stuff going on there that had nothing to do with the slaves. But the idea, I mean,
right.
Again, he talks about not
and
being
that's beside the point.
With it.
That's beside the point. I mean, it's like you said. I mean, I wouldn't fly the flag. I mean, I don't really. I mean, I'm a son of the South. I live in the South. Whatever. I'm not going to put a Confederate flag up in my front lawn.
I wouldn't either.
But like you said, it's this concern with the world. Well, why does he care what the world thinks? In your opinion?
Because in his mind and the mind of a lot of people, again, I know personally, their position, prestige, and prosperity in the world, whether they want to admit this verbally or not, is what drives their life. It really does. When it comes down to it, people are willing to vote for a party and see children die and see God's ancient covenant of marriage and his created order of gender utterly destroyed and perverted because it benefits them. Financially, at least they think it does. It doesn't actually, and they're going to find that out the hard way. But because it benefits me, I have a better chance of getting a better job, having a better future within their mind, which in their mind is defined as a better future financially, maybe on the economic ladder. This is an obsession with what the world thinks of me. We should be modeling, I guess what he says he wants in the world, but we should be modeling that in the church. Of course, there's no nation, kindred, tribe, or tongue. There's neither Jew, nor Greek, nor bond, nor free, nor male, nor female, barbarian, nor Scythian. All Christ is, all and in all. We're supposed to be showing the world that at the foot of the cross, once someone's adopted into, there is no difference. God sees everybody the same. That's what he says he wants. If you think the world is ever going to do that, you have a woefully deficient doctrine of sin. You're never going to get the world to be a just place. So I think that, his whole thing about, this flag, he is really concerned about this. And of course he would say, and so many people would say, well, it's easy for you to say, you're not black. The flag, doesn't mean anything to you because you're not black. I guess I can't say for certain because I've never been black, but I can't imagine myself ever giving any flag a second thought unless it actually were a threat. Let's just say I'm looking at a map and I say, well, this town over here might actually be dangerous, dear. It's probably best if we take this different route as we're going through this state. That would be a wise decision. But as far as the very presence of this flag represents all these things to me, that's your problem. Because I'm promising you it's a lot more important to you than it is to them.
Should we be sensitive to that? Should we care?
No.
Okay.
I mean, I'm just going to tell you flat out, don't expect that from me. I'm not going to sit down with you over dinner and listen to you go on for an hour about the evils of the Confederate flag. I honestly, I'm just going to be honest. Now, there are issues surrounding that era of American history that are important, but the presence of this flag in 2021 is not going to be a concern of mine.
Exactly. If you want to have a historical discussion about it, I'm all game, but don't try to convince me that you're still oppressed right now by that flag.
Oh, right. Or the idea. I mean, I almost fell off my chair here. He can't, like what you said, he knows that. He can't possibly believe, we're driving to town. Oh, Mildred, there's an American, or there's a Confederate flag there. Let's run for our lives. Oh, here they come. They got a rope. I mean, they're coming to get us. I'm not trying to be funny. And people say, see, you're making fun of it. You're being completely insensitive to the plight and what happened.
It's absurd.
It's ridiculous.
It is. It's preposterous.
There are some people out there, let's face this fact, there are some white folks out there that have white skin like mine that would kill black people if given the opportunity and thought they could get away with it. Those people exist. They're out there. There's little groups of them, but they are an infinitesimally small, almost unquantifiable portion of the population today.
To be completely honest, there's probably, statistically speaking, there are more black people who would kill white people based on their skin color than the other way around.
I would say that's true. Also, here's a little tidbit that people don't want to hear about. If you take a look at, like, say, the FBI crime statistics.
Oh, no, don't get into that. You can't get into these objective truths now.
Now we're talking about objective. I'm not even going to get it. We can do this a different time. But statistically speaking, that's numbers. That's where, this is what actually happens. Black people largely kill black people and white people largely kill white people. That's the way. There is not white people out there laying in wait to kill the next black man that comes along. Now, it is true that more black people kill white people than the other way around, but for the most part, people kill within their own race. I mean, it's like way over 50%. The point I'm making here is that this fiction that that all around the country, he doesn't even make it sound like it's all around the country. There's people like this, but that the country is like this. If I see a Confederate flag, my life's in danger. I better flee for my life.
That reminds me, I want to play one more quick clip for you before we get off here. I know we just got a couple of minutes left. Another one from Jarvis Williams.
Now I'm going to slow down a bit here because this is more heavy. When there are clear examples of racism and racial injustice committed against black image bearers, the loving thing to do is not to cite statistics of black-on-black crime, to deflect from the killing of that black body. As Pastor Jamal said in the first sermon, of course, blacks, we have some self-inflicted wounds. Every group has people within it with self-inflicted wounds. But we don't deflect from one truth because of the reality of another truth. When black bodies are killed unjustly, we don't respond by saying, Well, look at all the black on black crime statistics. That's not loving. There's a place for that conversation. Don't mishear me. In fact, I've written on that. But if I'm grieving the death of a child, and by the way, I am, the unloving thing to do would be to say, well, you have one son who's healthy.
Nobody's saying,
Greg.
nobody is saying, listen, here's the trouble with what he's saying here. I don't think he's even necessarily denying the reality of the situation, statistically speaking. In other words, if he were in on this podcast, he's not going to deny that black people, there's a lot of black on black crime. But here's the trouble with that. It's not deflection to say, take a look over here, when all you talk about is one aspect of it. If I saw you just as upset, now, if we're going to go by numbers, more black people are killed in a bad weekend in Chicago over a weekend than are killed in a couple years by white cops unjustly. If I saw you giving that kind, weeping and lamenting, why we have to find out why this is happening. Why are black people killing each other? And yes, it is wicked and evil when white people kill black people, or a white cop, God forbid, that is wickedness, uses his authority, his badge, the authority given to him by the state to take a man's life unjustly. Of course, that's terrible. But the problem with that is that happens almost never compared to the number of black people that are killing each other. It's not deflection to point to that. It's a question. Why do I see all your attention on this and not your attention on that? And the reason is because...
I'll tell you why. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
You go first, and then I'll tell you why I think.
It's because that doesn't serve the purpose they have. They're going to say because these black people killing each other, that's not symptomatic of this gigantic, systemically racist culture we're trying to address.
Well, I think it goes back to what you said at the very beginning of this, that they are doing exactly what they're accusing us of doing, making an idol out of their own race.
I do think that's true.
And when the only aspect that he can focus on is, white on black killing, and he's not giving the same focus to black on black killing or black on white killing, he's making an idol out of his own race. Same thing that he's accusing everybody else of doing.
Of course he would deny that. But see, this whole thing about once you define evidence off the table, once you've inoculated the conversation from the influx of data, there's no point in continuing. Like when he says, well, when I talk about, say the George Floyd case or some of these cases, there are cases, where you have a white policeman who unjustly, maybe in anger, kills a black man. It's not, it's not deflection. As soon as that happens, it's not wrong to say, well, for every one of those, there's 200 of these. That's not an evil thing to do. What if I actually care about those people? What if my heart is torn out when I see pictures of these little babies, these children being butchered and murdered in the street, shot, playing in their little swimming pool in the front yard? What if I'm tired of seeing black mothers laid out on the street, pregnant, shot to death? What if that really affects me? What if I'm really upset about this because I care about those people? See, in his mind, I can't exist. I have to only care about that because I'm protecting my whiteness.
And see, here's the thing. When something like, for example, George Floyd happens, immediately, I'll speak for myself here. Immediately, when that happened, my first thought was, oh no, an innocent person has been killed.
Me too.
I felt sorry for him, felt sorry for his family, and then immediately the Black Lives Matter stuff started coming out and pushing me away from feeling sorry for George Floyd and making me have animosity towards their movement. Pushed me completely away from it. And then all of a sudden, I'm probably guilty of this. I started having less concern for George Floyd and more concern about, trying to just get to the bottom of the truth here. And, does that make sense what I'm saying? It's not that I don't care about George Floyd and his life and others that are in similar situations, but it's like all of a sudden I felt the need to overshadow my feelings about the situation itself with having to defend against this influx of nonsense that took over through the Black Lives Matter movement.
Exactly.
And to this day,
themselves in the foot.
yeah, to this day, we still don't really know 100% without a shadow of a doubt what actually took place there. And there's no doubt about it. I mean, that cop did not get a fair trial. Was he guilty of something? I'm not going to argue against that. Maybe surely he was to a certain degree.
I have my theory on that.
He certainly, because of what happened here in this idolatry of race, not just in the church through people like Jarvis Williams, but the entire world, we were never able to actually get real justice, what these people say that they're actually after. Does that make sense? And that happens in so many of these cases. We idolize race, and then that becomes the driving issue rather than actual justice.
Especially since even in throughout the whole Derek Chauvin trial and in the sentencing, race never came up once.
Never once.
It wasn't even part of the argument. This guy hates black people. That's why he went after George. That wasn't even it. Nobody ever tried to make that case.
But tell me who was sitting on that jury who wasn't afraid to convict him. Maybe he was guilty, but there's no way that anybody sitting on that jury was not going to convict him.
I think he
because
deserved
of
to go
the fear of what would happen.
I think they overcharged him. That's another whole situation. But I'll tell you real quick what happened to me with this whole with the George Floyd incident. When it all came down and all that. Every time we have one of these high-profile cases, I wind up with people in my messenger, whether it be, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown. Any one of these cases comes up within hours. I got people. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? As if like, aha, what do you think about that? And my answer always is, I don't think anything about it. I don't have enough information to think anything about it yet. I've got a couple of news, sound bites on a newscast. And that would be the same way if it were anything. If it were, I don't care what the race of the people are, black, white, black. I'm not in a position to have any opinion about it, and neither are you. Now, let me tell you why that's important. The difference with the George Floyd incident with Derek Chauvin is that when you saw that video, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, because anytime something happens, you think, well, we don't know about this and we don't know about that. And, it could be same thing with, like I said, if it had been a black cop and a white guy that died. In the case with Derek Chauvin and George Floyd, I'm thinking, I cannot think of a scenario where this is good. It looks like this cop, something very bad happened here. Even when the first time I saw the video, I'm thinking to myself, I really don't. Okay, this one might be different. This looks pretty bad. This looks pretty bad on this guy. And but even then, as we started to get more information, yes, it was bad on the guy. I'll just tell you what I think. I think ego is what killed George Floyd and what hung Derek Chauvin. I think he was so aggravated. All I want you to do is get out of the truck and get in the car. He was like, you are defying me. By the time he had him on the ground, they tried everything. That's what really got me thinking is when you finally saw the whole video from the time he was pulled over. He's yelling that he can't breathe in the back seat of the car when nobody's touching him. One could be forgiven by the time he's on the ground. Okay, here he goes again with the can't breathe thing. However, there's people around Chauvin. If you listen, look, man, do this. And he's telling, I tried that already. He's in an argument with all these people. I think it's settled in on him. Look, I'm in charge here. This guy's not listening to what I'm saying. And bless God, I'm going to get him to do it my way. And he overdid it and the guy died. That's what I think happened. I can't swear to that in court. I may be proven wrong one day. But from what I see, I don't think he cared necessarily that George Floyd was even black. It was the fact this guy's defying me. I'm in charge and you're not doing it my way. And I got all these people who are civilians who don't know anything about the situation demanding that I do stuff. I'm going to do it the way I think. Oh, you want me to get up off him? I'm just going to stay on his neck.
Well, I certainly don't want to retry the George Floyd case here on our podcast because I don't think we're qualified to do that. But
no, but I mean, that's
the issue here is back to the church, Jarvis Williams, Jamar Tisby, these people who just immediately jump on this racial bandwagon as soon as something like this happens. Something like that would have even made the news if it were the other way around. Let alone,
That's true.
Jamar Tisby or Jarvis Williams giving two flips about it. So,
Yeah, if it were the other way around,
I think it's the idolatry of race. Just,
Well, and see, the thing about it too is that you and I, even having this conversation, everything each one of us has said is going to be interpreted as white supremacy. The only reason these guys are talking this way is because they don't realize it. And that's the thing, the condescension I'm getting from people. They don't exactly say it this way, but it's like, oh, the poor guy. He's just so wrapped up in his white supremacy, he doesn't see the way he's talking. And all I've done is given them piles of scripture. I haven't given you whiteness, I've given you the Bible.
I think when you get down, when you actually dig through what they're saying, when they're defining whiteness and how they don't like whiteness, when you actually get to the bottom of it, it's really biblical Christianity that they have a problem with.
That is the biggest thing. We should maybe take that up next time. Or we can talk. I still got a little time if you do, but real quick.
I'm going to have to get off here in about 5 minutes. So.
Okay. But real quick on that. That is the deadliest part of all, is when they take what they define as white theology, which is nothing more than what the scripture teaches. And again, I don't know. We talked about it briefly a time or two ago. Who knows why God decided to use, Western Europeans in order to salvage the gospel out of the clutches of Rome? I don't know. He didn't send me a text telling me this is why I did it that way. And to be honest, I don't care. I couldn't care less which group of people or which 5 groups of people. I don't. All I know is that once I was lost and dead in sin, and now I'm alive in Christ. And everybody else who's also alive in Christ is my eternal brother and sister. What difference does it make which group it came through? I mean, we don't complain that he used Israel. He made a covenant with Israel. He doesn't have a covenant with Western Europeans the same way he did with Israel. But he just decides to do certain things. I don't feel particularly important because of John Calvin, Martin Luther, or I don't feel like take pride. I don't care.
I have absolutely zero concern with any ethnic ties to any European reformers at all.
I couldn't care.
The only thing that I care about is the theology that came out of it.
That's right. I had somebody send me a year or two ago a picture that was alleged to be Augustine. St. Augustine. And he was portrayed as black, dark-skinned and black. And it was like, this is what Augustine really looked like. What if that's what he really looked like? What if this really is the true St. Augustine? And I was like,
what if?
Okay. What if it was? I really don't care.
Probably was. So what?
What if Jesus was African? What if he looked like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar? Who cares?
Maybe he was brown skinned. Who cares? Well, what difference does it make?
But he was waiting for me to defend. Well, I don't think that's how he was. He didn't look like. I don't care what he looked like. I don't care what part of the world he was from. What I do care about is the writings that he left us. That's what matters.
Yeah, I agree. Greg, I think we'll wrap it up with that tonight. This has been a very good conversation, and I do think we should pick it up next time with where we left off with this, with white theology and biblical Christianity. So with that, we'll end this. Thanks for being on the show tonight.
Amen.
Good night.
And you as well.